It all began on a cold, gloomy day in North Carolina, a place where the thick fog clung to the trees like a shroud, obscuring the hills that rolled lazily into the horizon. The air was damp, and a biting chill hung in the early morning air as people went about their usual routines. It seemed like any other morning at first, a quiet, almost peaceful start to the day. But there was something different this time, something small, subtle, but unsettling. At first, it wasn't easy to pinpoint exactly what felt wrong. It started with a few people, mostly elderly folks, or those who worked long hours at odd jobs, staggering around town in the middle of the day, their faces pale, their eyes glazed over in a way that didn't seem right. The kind of vacant stare that makes your skin crawl, like their minds were somewhere far away, or maybe not even there at all. They would shuffle down the streets, mumbling under their breath, completely unaware of the people around them. Their movements were stiff, robotic almost, as though they had lost all control over their own bodies. Of course, at first, people just brushed it off. It was easy to think that these were just a few bad days, maybe too much stress, maybe they had caught a nasty bug. After all, it was flu season, and people often got run down. But as the days went on, more and more people started acting the same way. People who had always been healthy, alert, and full of life. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, ordinary, reliable people started showing up in town like something was off. They had the same empty eyes, the same unsettling walk. No one could explain it. As the week went on, the situation became harder to ignore. In the town of Asheville, a bustling little community nestled between the Smoky Mountains, a few farmers discovered something that sent chills down their spines. It wasn't just a few odd people wandering around. No, this was something much darker. Early one morning, a local farmer named Joe Caldwell made his way out to the barn to check on his livestock. It was a routine he had done for years. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as he stepped inside the barn, something immediately struck him as wrong. The stench of blood hung thick in the air, mingled with the sharp iron tang of something far more sinister. The sight that greeted him was enough to freeze the blood in his veins. His cattle, which had always been healthy and well kept, were now torn apart, their bodies mutilated in ways that Joe had never seen before. Their stomachs were ripped open, their innards spilled out onto the dirt floor, like something had violently clawed into them. Guts were strewn across the barn, and several of the animals had been completely drained of blood. Joe stood there, his heart pounding, unable to move. It didn't make sense. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood trail leading out of the barn. Whoever, or whatever, had done this had been methodical, precise, and it had done it fast. Joe immediately called for help, but by the time anyone arrived, the damage was done. The farmers in the area began to talk, though. There were whispers of strange things happening to livestock all over the county. Some said it was predators. Others thought it might be a disease. But deep down, they all felt the same creeping unease. There was something wrong here, and it wasn't just the cattle. A few days later, the first person turned up dead. It was a man named Earl Thompson, a truck driver who had been known for his strong character and unshakable work ethic. He had been found lying in the middle of a dirt road just outside of Asheville, his body bloodied and mangled, like he had been attacked by something wild. But there were no signs of animal tracks, no claw marks, no signs of struggle. Earl's body was torn to pieces. But there was something even more chilling about it. The look on his face. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, as if in his final moments he had seen something beyond human comprehension. It wasn't long before rumors started spreading faster than the flu. People in town started talking about strange figures wandering the streets at night, walking with that same eerie, vacant look. Some said they heard growling noises from the woods just beyond the town, the kind of growls you'd expect to hear from wild animals. Others spoke of seeing people who should have been dead, standing by the side of the road, staring blankly ahead, unmoving. And then something worse happened. A group of friends, all locals, decided to go camping in the woods just outside of town. They had done it 100 times before, nothing to worry about. But when they didn't return the next day, the townsfolk started to worry. A search party was sent out, and what they found was enough to send the entire town into a panic. The campsite was abandoned, the tents torn to pieces, as if something had ripped through them. But it wasn't just the mess that was terrifying. The searchers found no trace of the campers, no signs of blood, no missing belongings, not even a single footprint. It was as though they had simply vanished, swallowed by the woods. That was when people started to realize something they had been trying to deny. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a flu bug. It wasn't just stress or a little bad luck. It was something darker, something terrifying. And soon it became clear that it wasn't just a small town problem. People all across North Carolina were reporting strange sightings, encounters with people who looked wrong. In places like Charlotte and Raleigh, people were walking in the streets, mouths dripping with blood, eyes wide and empty. Some spoke in strange, low growls, while others simply moaned as they shuffled aimlessly. The local authorities didn't know how to handle it. The sheriff's department was stretched thin, trying to deal with what seemed like an outbreak of something much worse than the flu. The National Guard was called in, but they too were unprepared for what they were facing. Helicopters flew over the city, trying to spot signs of where this new nightmare had begun. But nothing could prepare them for the truth. It wasn't until a few days later that the real horror started to show itself. In the dead of night, while most of the town slept, the infected, those who had wandered into the strange, trance-like state, began to gather. And it wasn't just a few people anymore. It was hundreds, thousands. They moved like a dark wave through the streets, drawn to the sound of screams and fear. It wasn't just the way they moved that was horrifying. It was the way they attacked. They were no longer human. They were something else. Something far more dangerous. They didn't care if you screamed. They didn't care if you fought back. They came for you. And when they were done, they didn't just leave you in peace. They turned you. They turned you into one of them. By then, it was too late to escape. North Carolina was no longer the peaceful, quiet state it once was. It had become ground zero for an outbreak that no one could explain. A nightmare that no one could wake from. Something was terribly wrong. Something very, very wrong. And no one knew if anyone could survive. It was a quiet evening in Boone, North Carolina. The kind of evening where the sky seemed to hang heavy with an orange hue as the sun began its slow descent behind the trees. The town, nestled between the mountains, had a calm, almost sleepy atmosphere, where nothing ever really felt out of place. The distant sound of crickets mixed with the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, creating the illusion of a world that hadn't yet been touched by chaos. The people were eerily quiet, their heads turned down as if they were watching something intently. Curiosity tugged at Thomas as he approached. He slowed his pace, his footsteps faltering as he tried to peer around the corner of the alley. At first, he saw nothing but shadows. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it. A woman, lifeless on the ground, her body twisted unnaturally, as though it had been thrown into the alley like a discarded rag doll. Her clothes were torn, her limbs bent at odd angles. Her face was obscured by a pool of dark blood. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Thomas saw next. One of the figures in the crowd, a man, or what used to be a man, was crouched over her, tearing into her flesh with ferocious hunger. He gnawed at her body as though it were nothing more than a piece of meat. The sickening sound of bones snapping and tearing, echoing in the alley. His hands were covered in blood, his mouth smeared with dark red, his eyes wide and unfocused. The woman's dog, a small terrier, lay nearby, its collar and leash still attached, but no sign of the animal. Thomas's stomach turned as he watched the grotesque scene unfold before him. For a moment, he wondered if he was dreaming, or maybe hallucinating. It couldn't be real. Couldn't be. But as he stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat, it became painfully clear. This wasn't some sick joke. This was real. Before he could even process what was happening, another of the figures turned its head, its movements unnaturally slow, as if it was aware of his presence. The eyes of the creature locked onto his, dark and hollow, a deep, unsettling emptiness in them. Thomas's heart raced, a wave of panic sweeping over him. He instinctively took a step back, but it was too late. With a speed that defied any logic, the creature lunged at him. Its mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth stained with blood. Thomas didn't even have time to scream before the figure was upon him, claws digging into his chest. The last thing he felt was a sharp, burning pain as the creature sunk its teeth into his throat, tearing him apart in an instant. The attack was over in moments. By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived on the scene, it was already too late. Thomas was gone, his body sprawled out on the cold pavement, his face contorted in an expression of shock and pain. The creature, having consumed its fill, had disappeared back into the shadows with the rest of the crowd, leaving nothing behind but a scene of carnage. The deputy stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had been working in Boone for years, and he had never seen anything like this. As he called for backup and cordoned off the area, the eerie silence of the alley seemed to grow heavier. He fought back to the strange reports he had heard in the past few days. People talking about odd behavior, about strange sightings in the streets. But this was something entirely different. As more deputies arrived, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It wasn't some lone madman. No, this was something far more sinister. The sheriff himself showed up a few hours later, his face pale as he surveyed the scene. His first instinct was to chalk it up to some kind of gang violence or a drug deal gone wrong. But the more he thought about it, the less it made sense. There was no way to explain what had just happened. There were no weapons involved, no signs of a struggle, no motive, just a bloody, senseless attack. And when the coroner examined Thomas's body, they found something that made the sheriff's blood run cold. There were no signs of any animal bite, no puncture marks, no trace of typical injuries that would be associated with a wild animal or a person. Just blood. So much blood. That night, the town of Boone went to bed in a daze, the horror of what had happened still lingering in the air. But little did they know, that was just the beginning. By morning, there were more reports, more attacks. People in nearby towns, Watauga, Blowing Rock, and even as far out as Banner Elk, were starting to witness the same thing. At first, it was just isolated incidents, whispers of a few strange deaths, but the more people talked, the clearer it became. It wasn't just one or two people who had snapped. It was more than that. It was an infestation. The sheriff's deputy was the first to recognize the pattern. He had seen it in the eyes of the people, the way they moved, the way they acted. It was as if something had taken over them, something that wasn't human anymore. He had seen enough in his years of service to know when something was wrong. But this was beyond anything he had ever faced before. By the time the sun set on Boone, the situation had escalated into something unrecognizable. People who had once been normal, quiet townsfolk were now roaming the streets in search of flesh, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. They weren't human anymore. They were something else. Something far darker. Boone, once a peaceful and quiet town, was now a war zone. The infection had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. People barricaded themselves inside their homes, their eyes glued to the windows as the sounds of screaming echoed in the distance. But the worst part? This was just the beginning. No one knew how it had started, where it had come from, or how far it would spread. But one thing was certain. The bloodshed had only just begun. The town of Boone was no longer a place of peace. It was a place of nightmares. It wasn't just a few sick people anymore. It was a full-blown infestation, and no one knew if anyone would survive. The first reports trickled in slowly at first, just whispers here and there about something strange happening in the small towns of North Carolina. At first, no one took it seriously. A few odd stories, maybe an isolated attack or two. People chalked it up to accidents, wild animals, or the occasional mental breakdown. But by the third day, it was impossible to ignore. What was happening couldn't be explained away by coincidence or imagination. It was something much worse. The infection, as it was quickly called, spread like wildfire across North Carolina, and it wasn't like any disease anyone had ever seen before. People who were unlucky enough to come into contact with it didn't just get sick, they changed. It was as though their very essence was ripped from them, leaving behind nothing but an insatiable hunger for flesh. What was even more terrifying was the speed at which it spread. This wasn't a slow-moving infection, like the flu, or something that could be contained with quarantine measures. This was different. It didn't spread through a bite. It wasn't carried by a single vector, like an animal or a human. No, this infection had a mind of its own, and it moved faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours, entire communities were being overrun. By the end of the first week, it had taken hold of every major city in North Carolina. It didn't take long for people to realize the full scope of the horror. The infection wasn't confined to the bitten. It was in the air, in the water, even in the food. It was like some sort of viral madness that could infect anyone, anywhere. People could be fine 1 minute, normal, healthy, and then in the next moment, they were changed, twisted into something far worse than human.
At first, there were the obvious signs. People's eyes would go wide. Their movements would slow. And then the madness would set in. The hunger. The insatiable thirst for blood. They would fall upon their friends, their families, tearing into their flesh with savage abandon. But even more horrifying was what happened next. Those who were attacked didn't die. They didn't stay dead. They got back up. They rose again, as though death itself couldn't stop them. As news of these attacks spread, people tried to protect themselves. It was a desperate attempt to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. They locked their doors, nailed windows shut, and huddled together in their homes, praying that they would be spared. But it wasn't enough. The infected, now moving in packs, could smell fresh meat from miles away. They didn't need sight or hearing. It was as though their hunger for human flesh was instinctive. And when they came, they didn't knock on the door. They broke it down. The creatures tore through the streets, moving with terrifying speed. Those who tried to fight back with guns or knives were no match for the horde. They were swarmed, overtaken, and pulled into the masses, dragged to their deaths by the ravenous undead. People started to realize that there was no safety anymore. There was no escape. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the infected came out in droves, wandering the streets in search of their next victim. It didn't matter who you were. Young, old, healthy, sick. They came for everyone. The once peaceful town of Asheville was now a ghost town, its streets filled only with the... The government's response was swift, but ultimately it was too little, too late. It didn't matter how many soldiers were sent in. It didn't matter how much firepower was brought to bear. They couldn't stop the infected. In fact, the more they fought back, the worse things seemed to get. The creatures adapted, they learned, and they became even more difficult to kill. By the time the military began evacuating civilians, it was already clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. Entire neighborhoods were overrun. There was no safe zone, no place where people could go to hide. The infected moved in packs, following no pattern other than a single-minded hunger. It was like they were driven by a single purpose: to consume, to tear apart everything that was human, and nothing seemed to stop them. The authorities tried to close off entire sections of the state, creating quarantine zones in hopes of isolating the infected. But the infection had spread too far. It was already in the air, spreading through the wind. No walls, no fences, no barriers were enough to stop it. Soon, the infection spread to neighboring states, and then to the rest of the country. The United States was crumbling, its very foundation shaken to its core. Cities like Raleigh, Charlotte, and Durham, once bustling, thriving metropolises, were now dark, empty shells. The infected had taken over, their bloodshot eyes always searching, always hungry. No one was safe. No one was immune. And then, there was the worst realization of all. It wasn't just North Carolina. It wasn't just the East Coast. The infection had spread across the country, faster than any government or military force could contain it. It was no longer a localized outbreak. It was a global pandemic. People had tried to run, to escape, but there was nowhere left to go. The infected moved with terrifying speed, and the rest of humanity was left in a desperate scramble to survive. Communities fell apart, governments crumbled, and cities turned to ruin. The infection was everywhere. It was no longer just a few people here and there. It was an unstoppable force, sweeping through the world like wildfire. The survivors who were left didn't know how to fight back. They didn't know where to turn. The world they once knew was gone. What remained were broken pieces of a civilization that had fallen, shattered by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't stop. In the end, the infection won. The infected didn't just consume bodies, they consumed the world itself. Humanity was left to pick up the pieces, but it was too late. There was no going back, no cure, no hope. The infection had spread too far. And by the time anyone had realized, it was too late to stop it. The world was already lost. The undead walked the earth, and for the living, survival was no longer guaranteed. The days had blurred together for Claire. The once vibrant world she had known, filled with children's laughter in classrooms and bustling streets, was now a distant memory. In its place was a desolate, unforgiving wasteland. The virus had turned her world upside down. People she knew, people she loved, were either dead or gone, lost to the horrors of the infection. The few who had survived, including Claire, had been forced to adapt quickly, becoming something they never imagined: fighters. It had been weeks since she and her group found refuge in a small cabin deep in the woods. The cabin, though small and worn, had offered them a modicum of safety. It was secluded enough that the infected rarely found their way here, and it had been one of the few places still standing when the world around them collapsed. Claire had been a teacher before all of this, someone who stood in front of a classroom, teaching young minds about the wonders of history and the intricacies of language. But now her skills had become irrelevant. Survival was all that mattered, and she had become a fighter, learning quickly how to use a rifle, set traps, and ration food. Every day was a battle, and she was still alive, still standing. That, at least, was something to hold on to. The group, which had started with 8, was now down to 5. The constant tension, the constant fear, had worn them thin. The supplies were dwindling, and it was becoming harder to find food. The infected were getting smarter, their numbers increasing, making it more difficult to stay out of sight. Every day, Claire and her group ventured out, carefully scouting the woods for supplies and watching for signs of movement. Every day felt like a countdown. They all knew that one wrong move could mean their end. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the trees, Claire went out alone. She had grown used to being alone in the woods, and it gave her time to think. The others had stayed behind to rest and prepare what little food they had left. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath her boots as she walked. Claire kept her rifle close, the cold metal a comforting weight in her hands. Her mind was preoccupied with the constant threat, but tonight something else tugged at her. Something in the distance that made her uneasy. She could feel it in her bones. As she moved deeper into the woods, the trees began to thin, and Claire found herself approaching a clearing. There, nestled among the trees, stood an old building. The roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were shattered. But it was unmistakably a church. A chill ran down Claire's spine as she stared at it. She hadn't seen any other structures in these woods before. At least not any that hadn't already been ravaged by time or the infected. Her curiosity, despite the danger, got the better of her. She cautiously approached the church, keeping to the shadows, making sure no one saw her. The infected were unpredictable, and she wasn't taking any chances. As she neared the building, she noticed strange things about it. There were no signs of the usual destruction. No broken doors, no signs of looting or violence. It seemed untouched. In a world... Claire hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. But she couldn't just leave. She had to know what was inside. Slowly, she stepped up the crumbling stone steps, the wooden door hanging loosely on its hinges. She pushed it open gently, the sound of creaking wood echoing in the eerie silence. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the scent of decay. Claire took a step inside, her boots scraping against the stone floor. What she saw inside froze her. It wasn't the usual disarray she had come to expect when stumbling upon an abandoned building. The pews, though weathered, were neatly arranged in rows as if someone had been using them recently. But it was the figures gathered in the center of the room that caught her eye. They weren't just wandering aimlessly like the infected she had encountered before. No, these people, if you could call them that, were gathered together in the middle of the room, as though in prayer or some kind of ritual. Their eyes were wide open, unblinking, their mouths slightly open, and their hands clasped in front of them.
They didn't move, not at first. Claire could barely breathe as she watched them. This wasn't a random group of infected. There was something deliberate about their positioning. Something organized. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone.
Then, out of the corner of her eye, Claire saw something even more disturbing. A figure in the shadows, standing at the front of the church. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by the dim light. But Claire could feel its presence. It was watching her, studying her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her heart raced. She instinctively reached for her rifle, her finger resting on the trigger, but she kept her breath steady. She couldn't risk making any noise. The last thing she wanted was to alert whatever that thing was. The figure didn't move, but Claire could feel its gaze on her. The silence in the church was suffocating, and the tension was unbearable. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Claire could hear her heartbeat in her ears, the only sound in the otherwise still air. She didn't know what she had stumbled upon, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary group of infected. These people, if you could still call them that, were being led by someone or something, a leader. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The last thing she wanted to do was find out more. She needed to leave, to get back to her group, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure in the shadows. When she took a step back, ready to retreat, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward her. And for a brief moment, their eyes met. The figure's eyes were pitch black, devoid of any humanity. Claire's stomach turned, her legs shaking. Without thinking, she turned and fled from the church, her heart racing, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She didn't stop until she reached the cabin, breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she pushed open the door. The others were already there, waiting for her. But Claire's mind was far from the safe haven they had created. What had she seen in that church? Who was the figure in the shadows? And what was this strange gathering of infected people? She knew one thing for sure. The infected weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore. They were organized, and whatever was leading them was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She had to tell the group. She had to warn them. But part of her knew that the horror was only just beginning. Claire had spent weeks tracking the signs. The woods had become her second home. Each tree, each creek, each patch of ground, now familiar to her. But it wasn't the land she was focused on. It was the growing mystery of the infection and its spread. She had learned to be a patient hunter, careful and calculating. Day by day, she mapped the patterns of the undead, noting where they moved, how they behaved, and most importantly, who or what was pulling the strings behind it all. It was a strange, inexplicable feeling, knowing that somewhere, out there, there was someone,
something orchestrating this hellish nightmare.
Claire had seen enough of the infected to understand their behavior. Most were mindless, driven only by hunger, roaming aimlessly, always searching for fresh flesh. But the ones she had encountered recently, they were different. They were more organized. There was something more sinister at play. At first, Claire had thought it was just a coincidence. That maybe the infected were gathering together out of pure instinct, driven to a place, a certain goal. But the more she observed, the clearer it became. This wasn't mindless wandering. These undead were being drawn to something, or someone. And that someone, Claire discovered, was far more terrifying than any creature she could have imagined. Her heart had skipped a beat when she finally pieced together the truth. The leader of the undead wasn't some random deranged madman or a grotesque product of the infection. No, it was a man, an old preacher from the nearby town of Chapel Hill. His name was Johnathan, and his story was darker than anything Claire had ever heard. Johnathan had once been a respected figure in the community, known for his sermons and his devotion to God. But what Claire had learned through careful research and piecing together the scattered bits of information from survivors was this: Johnathan had been a part of an underground religious cult, one that believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed that death was merely a passage, a temporary state, and that with the right rituals, the dead could be brought back to life. Claire had heard rumors of these kinds of groups, mad, dangerous people with twisted beliefs, but she never thought she'd be facing one of their leaders. It turned out that Johnathan had spent years experimenting on his followers, trying to unlock the secret to raising the dead. He had conducted rituals deep in the woods, hidden away from prying eyes. He believed that through the right combination of dark, forbidden magic and scientific methods, he could bring back those who had passed. His followers were his test subjects, willing participants in his deluded experiments. And that, Claire realized, was the origin of the infection. It wasn't some biological virus or random mutation. It was Johnathan's doing. The twisted rituals he had performed on his followers had unleashed something far beyond his control. The dead didn't stay dead, but they weren't revived in the way he had hoped either. They came back, not as people, but as something worse. Hunger-driven monsters, bent on destruction. Johnathan's obsession with resurrection had backfired spectacularly, and now the infection he had inadvertently created was spreading like wildfire across North Carolina, consuming everything in its path. But what terrified Claire the most wasn't just that Johnathan had created this chaos. It was that he could control it. Somehow, through his rituals, through his influence, he had gained control over the undead. They didn't just wander aimlessly like the typical infected. They were organized. They were purposeful. They were following orders, and those orders were coming from him. Claire knew that she had to warn the others, had to make them understand the true scale of the threat they were facing. She had hoped in some corner of her mind that it was all a mistake, that it was just a series of coincidences that had led her to this conclusion. But now, with the full weight of the truth settling in, she realized just how dangerous the situation was. Johnathan wasn't just a madman hiding in the shadows. He was a force to be reckoned with, and his power wasn't just in his ability to control the undead. It was in the way he had turned the dead into an army, a weapon, a tool for his twisted ambitions. Claire gathered her group around the fire that night, the flickering flames casting long shadows across their tired faces. They were exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally drained. The constant fear of the undead, the sleepless nights, the rationing of food and water, it had taken its toll. But this was no time for rest. This was no time to pretend that they could survive in isolation, tucked away in their cabin. They had to confront the truth. With trembling hands, Claire shared the horrific discovery with the others. Her words fell heavy on the group, each sentence sinking in like a stone. She explained how Johnathan had started the whole thing, how his rituals had brought the infection into the world. She told them about the power he had over the undead, how he had turned them into an army of killers, a force of destruction. And most chilling of all, she told them that he was still out there, watching, waiting, pulling the strings. The others listened in stunned silence, their faces pale as the realization hit them. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting something far bigger, far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The infection wasn't just some random outbreak. It was part of a twisted, dark plan. And the man behind it all was coming for them. But before they could process what Claire had said, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps outside the cabin. A moan, then another, then more. The undead were closing in. At first, Claire thought it was just a few stragglers. Maybe a couple of infected wandering through the woods, mindlessly searching for food. But as the noise grew louder, it became clear. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was coordinated. The undead weren't just roaming through the woods on their own. They were coming for them, drawn by some unseen force. Claire's heart pounded as she grabbed her rifle, her hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. The group quickly scrambled to prepare for the worst. They barricaded the doors, covered the windows with anything they could find. But Claire knew this wasn't just a typical zombie attack. It was a full-scale assault. It was Johnathan's army, and they were coming for them. The attack came like a storm. The creatures swarmed the cabin, relentless and overwhelming. Claire and her group fought with everything they had, but it was clear they were outmatched. They had no idea how many there were, how many had been sent by Johnathan. It didn't matter. The undead were everywhere, clawing at the walls, pushing through the barricades. Claire fired her rifle, her hands steady, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. One by one, the creatures fell, but more kept coming. And then, amidst the chaos, Claire saw something she couldn't believe. From the shadows of the woods, standing just outside the cabin, was Johnathan. His figure was outlined by the pale moonlight, his face obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking him. He stood there, watching, as if overseeing the slaughter. Claire's blood ran cold. The leader of the undead was right there, controlling the assault, directing his army with a twisted, malevolent purpose. It wasn't just an attack, it was a message, and it was clear. Claire and her group were no longer safe. They were marked, and Johnathan was coming for them. No one could stop him now. Claire stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the distance, the towering silhouette of the church looming in front of her like some kind of dark monument. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. The weight of everything she had been through pressed down on her, suffocating her. But she knew there was no turning back now. This was the end. It had to be. She had fought so long, so hard. But now, in the quiet of the night, with the weight of a broken world on her shoulders, Claire knew the only way to end it was to confront the source of it all. Johnathan. He was the one who had caused this. He had started it. His experiments, his twisted obsession with the dead had unleashed this nightmare. And now, his control over the undead was complete. Claire had seen it for herself, the way he had manipulated them, turning them into an army, his army, bound to his will. They were no longer mindless creatures, wandering aimlessly in search of flesh. They were soldiers, his soldiers, and they were all around her now. The church in front of her had once been a place of peace, a sanctuary for the faithful. Now, it was a place of darkness, a place where only death resided. As she approached the doors, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the very weight of the building was pressing down on her. The moonlight barely filtered through the stained glass windows, casting twisted shadows on the cracked stone floor. Claire's hands shook as she tightened her grip on the handgun in her right hand and the knife in her left. They were her only weapons, and they were all she had. With a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy doors of the church, the ancient wood creaking in protest as it gave way. The sound echoed through the empty hall, the only noise in the otherwise silent building. As Claire stepped inside, her eyes immediately locked onto the figure standing at the altar. Johnathan was there, waiting for her. His presence was imposing, and for a moment, Claire felt a chill run through her bones. He didn't look like the monster she had imagined. He wasn't some grotesque, rotting creature, twisted by the infection. He was still human, or at least he appeared to be. His face was calm, almost serene, as if he were at peace with what he had done. His dark robes hung loosely around him, and his eyes, though filled with a madness that Claire had never seen before, were sharp and calculating. He stood still, his hands clasped in front of him as he surveyed her, as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. "You came," he said, his voice cold, devoid of any warmth. He didn't sound surprised. He didn't sound threatened. He sounded pleased. "I've been waiting for you." Claire's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay focused. She knew she couldn't let him get to her. Not now. Not when everything depended on this moment. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving Johnathan's, but he didn't move. His gaze was unwavering, his smile widening as he looked at her. It was a smile that was anything but reassuring. It was the smile of a man who had long ago given up on humanity. A man who had embraced the darkness with open arms. "You don't have to do this," Claire said, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her. "You can stop. End this madness. You don't have to control them. You can still—" But Johnathan cut her off, his laugh low and mocking. "Stop? Oh, Claire, you don't understand. You never did. I am not controlling them. I'm guiding them. I'm leading them to something greater, something beyond life and death. This is not madness. This is the future, the true resurrection of mankind. Through death, we are reborn, and the world will kneel before the power I have unlocked." Claire shook her head, refusing to let his words sink in. This man had twisted the very fabric of life and death, turning the undead into weapons, and he had justified it to himself with sick delusions. He wasn't just mad, he was dangerous, and Claire knew that he wouldn't stop until everything was destroyed, until she was destroyed. She took another step forward, but this time the air seemed to change. The temperature dropped, the church growing colder as the undead began to stir. They were behind her, standing in the shadows, waiting for their cue. Claire knew that if she didn't act now, it would be over. She couldn't let Johnathan's vision for the world take root. The undead had already taken everything from her. Her friends, her safety, her sense of security. And now, they were going to take the last piece of humanity she had left. With a swift motion, Claire raised her handgun, aiming it directly at Johnathan's chest. The shot rang out, the sound reverberating through the church. But Johnathan didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. The bullet hit him, but it didn't stop him. It didn't even slow him down. Instead, he smiled wider, his eyes gleaming with twisted satisfaction. "You think a bullet can stop me?" Johnathan said, his voice now filled with mockery. "You think you can kill me? You cannot kill what is already dead." And then he raised his hand, and the undead around the church moved. They shuffled forward, their eyes locked on Claire, their mouths dripping with hunger. They were his army, his soldiers, and they were coming for her. Claire's breath quickened as she fired again, each shot finding its mark, but it was futile. More came, and more. The church was alive with the sound of movement, the shuffle of feet, the gnashing of teeth. Her gun was empty, and she dropped it, pulling the knife from her side. She fought with everything she had, slashing, stabbing, but they just kept coming. They were relentless. They were his to command, and they wouldn't stop until she was dead. Her movements grew desperate, each swing of the knife a fight for her life. But no matter how hard she fought, no matter how many of them she brought down, the odds were against her. The undead were everywhere, and Claire knew she couldn't keep this up forever. Jonathan's voice rang out again, louder this time, filled with triumph. "It's over, Claire. You can't win. You never could. This is the end." And as Claire fell to her knees, surrounded by the undead, the cold reality set in. She had come so far, fought so hard, but in the end, it wasn't enough. Jonathan's grip on the undead was too strong. His power was too great. The church fell silent, save for the soft, ragged breathing of Claire as she struggled to stay conscious. She looked up at Johnathan, seeing the madness in his eyes, and for a brief moment, she understood. This wasn't about survival. This was about control. Johnathan didn't care about the world or the people in it. He only cared about his own twisted vision. And now, the world would belong to him. With one final scream, Claire was lost to the horrors of the undead world. The church, once a symbol of faith, became a tomb, a place of eternal darkness, where no one could escape the hell that Johnathan had unleashed. The world outside would never know peace again, and the undead would rule. And so the final stand ended not with victory, but with the silence of the dead, their army marching forward, their leader's madness now fully realized. The horror of North Carolina's zombie infestation was complete. The world would never be the same again.